So I think this is. So yeah, I was talking about like the EWWD is really a timely project that brings the power of technologies to facilitating development of a smart digital healthcare solutions to enable healthcare professionals to more actively manage patients' care. Now, as you can see here in, so I think the slide, okay, I was actually hoping to see the agenda here. So our agenda today, it will be mainly talking about our cutting edge clinical movement analysis platform that is centered on remote monitoring of patients through machine learning driven and AI driven technology, and mainly focused on quality of movement improvements. So the format of today's workshop will start with the introduction to the EWWD, then a demonstration about the quality of the movement model, and then will be followed by a presentation about the potential clinical applications of the model. After the presentation, we will have question and answers session about the model and the EWWD. After this, we will be divided into small groups to discuss shared research interests and ideas, and how and ideas actually for a new collaborative research projects with the EWWD. So I hope you will enjoy the workshop. And at this stage, I would like to introduce Jean-Luc, who is the CEO of HexTransforma Healthcare and the Chief Investigator of the EWWD. Hand over to you, Jean-Luc.
Thanks, Mohammad. And thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate your time. As much as we herald technology being the savior of the COVID pandemic, I think we can all agree that it doesn't come without a few bugs in getting something as complex as a workshop with quite a few people mobilized. So yeah, let me join Mohammad and welcome you all again to this workshop. I really I don't want to take too much of the time. I know there's a lot of really interesting stuff to be discussed. Just want to give you a bit of background about EWWD and about the project as a whole. And then obviously I think I'll hand back to the team. So HexTransforma Healthcare is the lead partner in the EWWD project. The project, as I'm sure most of you probably are not aware, is actually 3 sub-projects. There is the EWWD, the early warning wearable device aspect of the project, which is the main part of it, which focuses really on lower limb MSK care with a view to being able to map the whole clinical pathway for foot and ankle, knee and hip, as well as incorporating vital signs monitoring and then post-operative care for patients. So really, our objective, our hypothesis is to be able to improve patient outcomes through the management of the care of patients throughout the care pathway, irrespective of which disorder they are suffering with. The second aspect of the project is that we are looking at social mobility. Particularly, if anyone knows about the Interreg FC program, we're looking at social mobility within the FCE area, which tend to be coastal towns in northern France and the south coast of the United Kingdom, and the impact of low social mobility on young people in particular in those areas. With a particular focus on technology. We are a medical technology firm looking at technology as effectively future jobs, future prospects in STEM, and trying to encourage young people into jobs in STEM. We're also running, the third part of the project is looking at a medical technology challenge, which is called quite accurately the MedTech Challenge. And this is a competition that we're running across 200 schools, 100 in France, 100 in the UK. And it's akin to Dragon's Den type competition, again targeting schools in very sort of socially impoverished areas of the FCE area, and trying to encourage young people from these low socially mobile backgrounds into certainly the consideration of careers in technology. So we and our partners, and I'm sure we'll talk about the partners in more detail, but there are 9 partners on the project. Well, actually 10, I correct myself, 10 partners on the project. Collectively, we are looking to bring young people into STEM careers, into encouraging them into considering medical technology, fintech, and all aspects of that. All culminating in a very, very exciting Agincourt style, French versus the UK final, for schools to effectively develop a medical technology solution, which we will then manufacture a prototype for, and show that kids can have great careers in technology, and can have great careers and aspirations, certainly in the medical technology space. So those are the 3 key areas. We are exceptionally dedicated as a firm, but also as a partnership, into welcoming other research institutions into sharing data with other research institutions about the work that we are doing. I mean, I think that really is part of the DNA of the FCE program, and we welcome your input. We also recognize that all of you who have joined us who are not part of the program have your own research, and you have your own hypotheses that you are working on, and wherever we can help support you with the data and the work that we're doing, we're obviously open to that conversation and that collaboration with you. So we as a program will carry on running up until the November 2023, and we are aiming to put more than 2,000 patients suffering from lower limb MSK disorders through this program, through this project, between now and the end of the program. And we genuinely believe that we will be able to collect a significant amount of data, not only regarding quality of movement, which is obviously the subject of this particular workshop, but more broadly, patient care and improve patient outcomes, and also hopefully generate a data set that allows us to research further into the future into treatment and physiotherapy, etc., of lower limb disorders across the UK and France. So without further ado, I think I've probably been talking way too long already. I'm going to hand back to Eva, I believe it is, and we'll run through the remaining agenda for the workshop today. But thank you all again for joining.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-Luc. So if there's any questions to Jean-Luc, I think we need to keep these questions till the end of the presentations. So so at the moment, I would like really to welcome Stuart and to introduce him who is the head of data science, and he will walk through of the quality of movement model process, and I think he will have also some demo data for today's presentation. Stuart, hand over to you.
Excellent, thank you, Mohammad. So, can I have the next slide, please, Yoga? Excellent, thank you. So, as Mohammad says, I'm Stuart Hewitson. I'm the head of data science at HexTransforma Healthcare. So, to date, for the past sort of 6 months or so, my research and my team's research has been around taking data out of the laboratory, out of sort of observations which have been made in a gate laboratory, and saying, can we take that and can we apply machine learning to that? So what is, for example, the minimum sensor set that we would need to be able to infer joint angles when somebody's walking along normally, and can we then generalize that? Because there's a lot of research, and a lot of research has come out quite recently as well, looking at how to use machine learning in this area, but it is restricted to sort of looking at things in a particular setup in a particular laboratory. And our hypothesis, to use a very good word that Jean-Luc uses, is that actually we can actually find a way of generalizing that. So rather than it being that you have to actually be in a specific location and you have to walk in a specific way, actually we can take that and we can apply that machine learning to data which is generated by commercial off-the-shelf IMUs, which can then be used by people actually in their day-to-day living. And that's the premise upon which we have been developing our research and developing the models that are currently coming out of that research. And my goal today is to share some of that with you. Hopefully, indicate where we have got to so far, where we're heading, and take any questions, and also hopefully excite you as to the potentials in this area. So next slide, please. Cool. So just to outline the approach that we've taken for this, I mean, there are many approaches out there when you read the literature, and some approaches try to predict just, for example, in the sagittal plane. Some approaches try to predict all dimensions for a particular joint using a single model. We've taken a completely different approach. Because what we are trying to do is we are trying to come up with a real world system at the end of the day. One, as I say, which can use commercial off-the-shelf IMUs. For that, we need to be able to say, okay, so a particular model architecture may not be the best model architecture for predicting the sagittal plane versus another plane, of the knee versus the ankle versus the hip. So we end up with a scenario where what we're actually trying to do is we are, for each joint, so ankle, knee, hip, we are creating 4 models for each of the dimensions which exist. So X, Y, Z, we will have 4 models for each, and that allows us to then take account of any dropouts in data, for example. So it may be that we find that actually one of the sensors it has a glitch in the data for a period of time, so we can swap over and we can see if there's another model that we can use instead for inferring the actual joint angle for that. So that then gives us effectively 72 deep learning models that we can apply throughout the system. And we're actually looking at expanding that at the moment, because so far our work has been looking at IMUs specifically, so that would be the sort of sensors you attach on the shank, the thigh, the pelvis, and specifically looking at the ideal number of those IMUs to be able to actually infer the joint angles, which is between 3 and 5 from the work that we've done so far. What we are now also looking at is using insoles. So we're looking at expanding this research to actually look at the impact that adding insoles into that sensor mix will have, not just from a pressure perspective, but also having IMUs in those insoles as well. So that 72 models could quite easily double to 144 to basically allow us to actually use the best available data, which is coming through at a specific point in time. Down the bottom, in quite a small diagram, but nonetheless quite an interesting diagram, is a summary of some of the results we're getting. So we've got the Pearson correlation coefficient, where you can see effectively on a sort of comparison against the gold standard, and on a sort of between sessions basis, we are getting a Pearson correlation coefficient of close to 1. I mean, it's generally above 0.9 every time. The residual mean squared error and the mean absolute error are, I'm told by my learned colleague Mohammad, quite acceptable for what we are achieving there as well. So if you go on to the next slide, Yeva, the famous curve. So this curve here is showing just a very small slice of the knee, I think it's the left knee of a subject in the sagittal plane. And what it demonstrates here is the blue line, which in some cases is actually quite not very visible, but the blue line is the data which is being reported by the gold standard. So that's the MVN, NTX or Viva sensors within the gate laboratory. So these are, that's the angle as measured in the gate laboratory. The orange line is the model's prediction, given the data that we've given it, of what that joint angle would be. And as you can see, it's fairly close in most areas to that blue line. There is a little bit of deviation, as you would expect, just because, again, as I understand it, the blue line is being generated by an algorithm anyway. So there is to be expected a little bit of deviation there. But effectively, at the end of the day, just using 3 sensors, we are able to get that angle out. And that's not having a sensor on the shank and the thigh, for example, as you might expect for the knee, and it's not doing any biomechanical calculations within the analysis that we're doing. This is purely on machine learning, deep learning. Next slide, please. So this now is just giving you the bigger picture of that small chart we had a second ago. So it just demonstrates. And at the top, you can see the sensor combinations we've tried. So we've tried 3 sensors. Those 3 sensors would be left shank, right shank, and pelvis. And then we've got the pelvis and one shank. So if we're trying to predict on the left, it would be the pelvis and the left shank. And if we're trying to predict on the right, it would be the pelvis and the right shank. Then we've also got both shanks, so but leaving out the pelvis. So what would that look like there? And then what we also have is one shank. So that's literally using a single sensor. So can we derive something from the single sensor? And in that case, of course, because we're looking at walking, what it's doing is it's actually determining the pattern that you're getting from somebody walking quite normally. Next slide, please. So that was the intra-sample prediction. This is now the inter-session prediction. So this is where it hasn't seen the data that it's now predicting on before. So as would be expected, we do get a drop-off in the Pearson correlation coefficient, but it is not massive. It's within acceptable ranges, and it demonstrates to us that these sensor combinations are still actually quite generalizable. And it also means that when we are looking at something like the knee, for example, we are within the same sort of tolerances as the gold standard equipment that exists out there, whether that be like the sort of the Vicon image type stuff, or whether it be the sort of sensors that you would use in the laboratory. And this data can then, these models can then actually be used with off-the-shelf sensors. They don't have to use the same sensors that they were trained on. That's the other really key thing about the way that we're doing this. Next slide, please. So this slide now demonstrates that very fact of taking the data from, I think it was actually Mohammad walking around using off-the-shelf sensors. So it was using off-the-shelf commercially available sensors, which are, I think it works out, this particular brand is about €500 for a set of 5 sensors. And taking that data and running it through the models to then look at what his knees were doing during that period of time. So this is a sort of a range of 500 sort of sample steps. The data itself is being collected at 60 hertz, so that's just under 10 seconds worth of data there. Next slide. So what we have also done is one of the things we are looking at now is we are obviously looking to sort of generate a platform that we'll be able to work with this data on, and effectively have a clinical platform where we can present this data through to clinicians and make suggestions and recommendations based upon the data coming through, but also, as Jean-Luc was saying, making the data available to yourselves, making sort of inference from the models available. So we've pulled something together to share principles. I mean, this wouldn't be necessarily the exact way that we would share it, but it's just to demonstrate how some of the information that we're getting through we're able to analyze, etc. So if I just share my screen, I will just select this screen here, share that. So this is the login page. If I now sign in, then we've got some analysis that I would have done this morning of a female who's 34 years old. You notice we've just got an idea here because, you know, as with all good sort of research data and really you know, key to this project is that this is all anonymized data, and therefore is you know, I would never know who this individual is. So I'm going in here now. I've got a summary of, you know, for example, quality of movement, some sort of gait analysis data relating to step length, velocity, distance, etc., and some activity detection coming through. So these are all areas that we are looking at and we are considering as part of the work we're doing. If I go back to the quality of movement here, for example, if I wanted to drill into the right knee Z, because it's my favorite one, I can just click on this. This will now drill me down into looking at what is going on. And just for comparison, I got the guys to put the left knee on every time you select the right knee at the moment, because then that way you can see the patterns emerging. This is raw, you know, raw output from the model. So it's a bit spiky. Obviously, we would smooth that, but again, the reason for the raw output is because, you know, this is all work in progress and is something that we're looking for feedback on. We're looking for the involvement of you know, researchers such as yourselves in looking at this sort of area and you know, looking at the validity of the models, etc. So that's what we're working on, and I will quite happily take questions on in a sort of short period of time. So if you want to share your screen again, Yeva. At quality of movement models which actually forecast the joint angles over a normalized movement cycle, and you know, looking at then how we can actually intelligently turn around, and probably, you know, going you know, touching on that question that you've asked, Lex, about the how we're defining or detecting pathology in the user's gait, is being able to sort of look at what we would detect normally. And you know, ultimately, what we want to do is we want to be able to train these models to detect and classify the pathology that may be present, and also in some ways to remove certain pathologies. So, because we are going to be dealing with comorbidities going forwards, you can imagine a situation in which somebody may have Parkinson's disease, and we actually want to be able to say, well, we're not trying to detect for Parkinson's disease here. So actually, how can we then work with that? So right now, what we've been doing is obviously training the models on what I would call healthy people's data. Certainly, as part of the EWWD project, we absolutely want to have as many different pathologies going through and you know, being detected by the models as we can, and to be able to label and classify those pathologies. To some degree, I think it would probably be a case of looking at the pathology, looking at the outputs of the models and looking at how they vary from what would be normally expected. And to another degree, it's obviously going to be through the models learning over time as well, and feedback loops within the solution. And that's a really key goal of the EWWD project, is to actually have by the end of it, to demonstrate that the fact that we can actually you know, detect those pathologies and then feedback and make a recommendation. Obviously, never sort of overrule, but recommend to the clinician that pathology may be present. Next slide, please, Yeva. Yeah, and so moving on to the next steps. what we would have is, as part of this workshop, the sort of the working together and thinking about that. Mohammad, did you have any thoughts on Lexi's question about defining or detecting pathology in a user's gait?
Yes, I think this is a very good question. So if you don't mind, I think we could just leave this till the end of the presentations, after Kate's presentations, where we will have the discussion, questions and answers, because I think this will generate some discussions around this, as there is no direct answer to this as far as I'm concerned. Is that fine with you, Alex?
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, happy to wait to the end. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stuart. So it's really very exciting, really. I personally very exciting, really, to see that we are within this project now is able to transform our laboratory and clinical research a step closer to enable people to use wearable technology in their own environments. So I'm happy now to introduce Kate Button, who is a reader in physiotherapy, and she will talk to us about the application, or how she sees this, the applications of this model in clinical settings and for patient benefits. Hand over to you, Kate.
Okay, thank you, Mohammad. Good morning, everybody. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so that looks quite dark on my screen, so I hope you can all see that. So today I'm going to be talking about the clinical application of a quality of movement model. So I'm a physiotherapist, and I've been working for a physiotherapist for over 20 years. But I'm a physiotherapist who's also been very involved with research around movement analysis. And movement analysis, I guess, has been integral to my working as a physiotherapist. And I've seen a lot of changes over the years, and moved from collecting data within biomechanics laboratories back out into the clinic and back into laboratories. So for me, this project is really exciting, because finally it feels as if we're in a situation where we can start to move movement analysis closer to people's homes and everyday lives, which is really where me as a physiotherapist wants to make an impact. So I work for Cardiff University as a reader, doing a lot of research. My area of interest is musculoskeletal. But I also work within Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, and I've worked there for many years now as a physiotherapist. And more recently, I've become the R&D lead for therapies within Cardiff and Vale University Health Board, which is a great opportunity in which really to start to move, this technology in clinical applications of technology forward within the therapies environment. So could I have the next slide, please? So just to say something about musculoskeletal conditions. So probably a lot of you might already be aware of how big a problem this is. So there's estimated to be 18.8 million people in the United Kingdom with musculoskeletal conditions. And this spans a whole range of conditions, from mainly just the pain conditions, I guess, which are musculoskeletal pain, which I work with, through to the sort of more inflammatory conditions. But there is a lot of people suffering with musculoskeletal conditions. And what we see in physiotherapy is lots of people with low back pain. And we see lots of people, 8.75 million people in the United Kingdom are currently seeking treatment for osteoarthritis, of which the knee is the most common joint to be affected by osteoarthritis. And when we see these people within physiotherapy, some of the main problems they're having is obviously pain and loss of function. And this is what we're trying to help people manage. And this is where the movement analysis comes into the treatment. I think as well, what's really important, especially for me as a physiotherapist, to think about, and this is data from Wales, But in Wales, 50% of people with musculoskeletal conditions are classified as inactive. And this means that they are doing less than 30 minutes of activity a week. So as somebody who's always worked with physical activity and exercise and movement, you know, this is for me a fairly horrifying statistic. And so really, again, I think looking at how we can use movement analysis to encourage and motivate people to move as well. I think it has a place as a role in increasing physical activity. And we know that if people are physically inactive, it puts them at greater risk of other comorbidities, other illnesses, but also at risks of things like falls, which is obviously a major problem, and you know, to the individual in terms of the impact on their life, but equally in terms of health resource use as well. Coupled with that, in Wales, 70% of people with musculoskeletal conditions are overweight or obese. And 4 in 5 people with OA have a multi-morbidity. So that means that they don't just have osteoarthritis, but they have another comorbidity alongside that. And certainly within Cardiff and Vale, with the orthopaedic department, we've done some research looking at the comorbidities and BMIs alongside the patients we see. And this very much holds with the data that we have collected. And I think this is probably very important for the EWWD project in terms of thinking. It's, you know, as clinicians, we think a lot about lots and lots of different concepts at any one time. So we might be thinking about movement analysis, but we will be coupling that with information about other morbidities, BMI, and other complex issues. Could I have the next slide, please? So physiotherapy is also changing. You know, physiotherapists probably traditionally have always been linked with exercise and looking at people moving. But where we treat patients is changing. Now, that was happening before COVID and has very much changed since COVID. So I think traditionally physiotherapists were always thought about of seeing people in a hospital, in outpatient departments, sometimes seeing people in GP clinics. But as the pathways are changing, physiotherapists are working in different ways, and they're becoming lots of first contact practitioners for musculoskeletal conditions. So they're the first people in the pathway that a patient might encounter when they're seeking help for their joint pain. Physiotherapists can be found in GP clinics, but also out in the community, but maybe more now moving away from, in some ways, moving away from everybody being seen traditionally in a physiotherapy department, but being seen in leisure centres and other areas within the community. And COVID has really changed that, because a lot of treatment for musculoskeletal conditions has gone online. And is still online. You know, I don't think we imagined when we first started this that we would still be treating online. And it's taken a lot of time to get those, to just get online consultations or telephone consultations, you know, up and running. People are still learning and still trying to get that right. But I think that, you know, there's a very much a definite belief that technology and continuing with an online method will continue beyond our current way of working. And so it's really important to get that right, but also to look at how do we get these other technologies and the information that these other technologies, such as the wearable sensors, can give us to integrate into that sort of online consultation, where maybe the physiotherapist isn't sat in the same way anymore in front of a patient in a department, but things like watching how people move, which is what we've always traditionally done. And that has been, I guess, the clinician standard tool for movement analysis has been observation. You know, how are we going to do that differently going forward in the future? How can wearable technologies really assist that? And how can we make, I guess, the data that's generated from that, the vast amount of data, relevant to the clinician, important, and quick to access, and it must be understandable to the patient in lots of ways as well, because I would like to think that a lot of what we do is based around shared decision making. It's not just always the clinician. It's not the clinician just making a decision about what treatment's going to be happening to someone, but it's a self-management approach, and it's where we talk about the options for different individuals. And often with physiotherapy, within our assessments, however we're doing them, face-to-face or online, often that results in, especially for conditions, musculoskeletal pain conditions, especially for osteoarthritis, will often involve an exercise program, an exercise prescription, along with other self-management strategies and advice and information as sort of first line treatments that we would give. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So as a clinician and as a researcher, thinking about the different options in terms of how you do clinical movement analysis. So I've been very fortunate. I've had the opportunity as a clinician to work with biomechanists and to do projects which have involved movement analysis laboratories. And they've really been the gold standard of how we measure movement. In musculoskeletal, though, that's not been a way of measuring movement that's been an option for the individual patient to help in their decision making. Certainly not around where I work, and I'm sure there's good examples of where that does happen, but not in our Cardiff setup. Even though we have really great facilities in Cardiff for movement analysis laboratories. So as a clinician working alongside doing my research for many years, the only tool I had was eyeballing how people move. And that tends to be watching how people walk, how people run, depending on the condition, how people do activities such as squatting, balancing on one leg and squatting, and maybe how they're jumping or hopping. So looking at different activities based on the patient and depending on their individual needs and the activities they're intending to go to. And when we do observational movement analysis, we would tend to look at people from the side as they move and from the front how they move. So we'd often look at people in two planes, but obviously trying to couple those two planes together, can be quite challenging. And you have to think about how fast people move. Movement and taking activities such as walking is complex. There is the multiple phases, the time points within phases that you would want to try and highlight. And when you're looking at multiple planes and multiple joints, we have to question as clinicians how accurate we are at doing that, and are we doing the best? And the challenges of that is the patient can't see what we're looking at either. So we can do this observation and we know what we've looked at, and then without any technology try to describe maybe to an individual with knee pain what we think the problem is, but how can we understand, how can we expect people to understand when they're not able to see that? So people nowadays are using phones much more in clinical practice to record maybe how an individual is moving on their own device, because obviously we worry about security and data as well. So on their own device, so they can see how they're moving. And I've certainly done a lot of work in my research with video cameras and recording how people are moving, and using software then to get joint angles out of that, so moving at a step forward. But I think what's been really exciting over the past few years has been the wearable technology, and especially the off-the-shelf sensors, and how they can be used in a clinical setting to measure everything that we want in terms of multiple joints in multiple planes, multiple activities in real time in a short space of time. That is possible to achieve within a really almost within a treatment session that a patient might be able to have. And you know, that's a bit different to how the lab works, where often people would need to come in for several hours. The sensors have enabled us to really cut down the amount of time it requires to get all of this movement data around, especially around joint angles and variables such as velocity, step length, jump height, all of those things. And so I should say that a lot of our research that we've been doing using sensors has been in the clinical setting, because again, asking people to take home these multiple sensors, which are brilliant but have limited battery life, require charging, and require different calibrations and things, is again probably been a step too far from us. But again, this is where it's exciting working with the EWWD team in terms of looking at reducing those sensor sets through machine learning and the algorithms that they're developing. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to highlight to you the importance of movement analysis and where this sits within maybe how a clinician thinks and how maybe a physiotherapist thinks, because I don't want you to think that, you know, all we do is think about movement analysis in isolation, and it has to be placed within the context of everything else we do. So around the outside, you can see the clouds where I've got pain, function, participation. So these are maybe the things that we're thinking about, and goals we might be setting with patients around trying to help them in their everyday lives, that, you know, that for them, it's maybe important to have some pain relief so that functionally, they find it easier to squat down to reach some cupboards or to walk to a shop to return to the sport. And they want to be able to participate in activities that are important to their everyday lives. So the first thing we do when we first see people is do a clinical assessment. And that clinical assessment involves lots of different activities, involves talking to patients, finding out a lot about them, a lot of person-specific information about the history of their condition, about them as individuals and their goals and challenges that they might have. We would also do a physical examination, maybe, in different ways, and get clinical data about individuals, maybe about how much their joint moves, about how strong their muscles are, about different things as well, though, about what investigations they've had done, what medication they're on, what their BMI is. So that's just some ideas. We might also now, it's a lot more common to have patient-rated outcome measures being collected on individuals. And so we would have the information from all those outcome measures as well. And then also modifying all of that is the individual clinician's knowledge and experience as well. And that would really make a difference, especially again, in terms of movement analysis. And then within that, we've got movement analysis. And so, as I said, for most people, this would probably in the clinical setting now, in the average physiotherapy department or in the average online consultation, would involve some kind of observation analysis, which is either maybe recorded or is just pure observation. And the information that we collect from that clinical movement analysis, so and this is my perspective on it, is used in a number of different ways. It's used in education, so patient education and information. And you'd use that for things like maybe helping people to get the correct exercise technique, because if you're prescribing exercise, what you don't want people to do is to go away and do their exercises incorrectly. So you want to look at how they're doing their exercises, and try to go through to make sure people get the idea of the correct technique. And that's where movement analysis can be really, really important. But this can be challenged how this can be challenging. Sorry, I'm looking at the question and trying not to get distracted. Jane, I will come back to you about that, because there is lots of challenges around this. So the correct technique, you know, how do you teach somebody the correct technique when they're so used to moving in a particular way? And that is where feedback comes into it. And I think correct technique is important, because I think it links to Jane's question. If somebody is used to doing something in a certain way, you know, is that right or wrong? And we do very much have to make a decision as to whether it is something that's worth changing on an individual or addressing on an individual. And you know, those are difficult decisions, and that's, you know, down to, I guess, individual clinicians' interpretation, but also whether they think it's going, if somebody's doing an exercise incorrectly, they might not get the strength benefits from it. Okay, and again, education in terms of performance and technique, how they're moving. You know, is there a risk of a tripping because somebody, you know, isn't moving their joints in a way where it looks like they're risk of falling or tripping? Are they landing from jumps in such a way that they've got very stiff, maybe, landing technique, of which case, you know, again, that could put them at risk of further injury. One thing therapists like to do is talk about loading of joints as well. Now, that is problematic because we don't measure loading. Loading is quite difficult to do. You know, we don't do that in terms of what we do in the clinical setting, but we often do generalize and have conversations around loading of joints. And also, I've touched on this already, education around safety and risks. So again, I think the falls, joints giving way, and how can education around movement maybe help people think about that, and help them to maybe prevent these things from happening. So movement analysis in terms of feedback, you know, using that in terms of getting people to move differently, in terms of training how they move, is very important, and it's something we do a lot of as part of our treatments, intuitively within physiotherapy, sometimes without even thinking about the fact that we're doing that. We use a lot of mirrors, just giving people verbal commands in terms of giving feedback. And like I said, you want to take the information from how we observe people moving and any movement analysis we do to prescribe exercises. What exercises do we want people to do? So might this be around strengthening, because is it about range of motion, and is it about different control exercises? Is it around balancing exercises? So when I say control, it's around neuromuscular control, getting people to break down different activities and practice how they're doing them in a particular way, because they're struggling to do that. Okay, but now the green lines, I guess, is how things are changing, how things are very much changing in terms of COVID, and how things changing, how we go forward. So the home environment is really important. How people move in a lab, how they move within a physiotherapy department might not be how they move in a real life situation in their home. And I think the expectation is that we need to be assessing movement in the home environment. We also need to be able to, you know, up what we do in terms of assessing movement. You know, I don't think that visual observation on its own is maybe enough, and having some objective measure is really important. And this is something patients have actually, I've been quite surprised in terms of our research, have really given us feedback about, and I will come back to in a minute. I think using wearable technologies, being able to measure movement in the home, even in the physiotherapy department as well, will really aid online consultations. Real time is important. Everything I've done in the past is you measure it on an individual, they go home, and then on the next session, which could be up to a month later, you talk about what you've measured, in which case everything might have changed. So I think the real time is important now. And I think we need to think about the role of monitoring. I think This is a difficult area. You can use things like movement analysis as a tool to monitor, are people doing their exercises? How is their condition changing at home? I think that's important, but I also think that we need to be careful with that. Not everybody will want that. It's an individual thing, but it is there as an option as well. So could you just move on to the next slide, please? So underpinning this is we need to, I was a clinician, you know, this is what I'm thinking about in doing, but I think in our research, and I don't want to dwell on this now, but we must be thinking about the underpinning mechanisms as to why movement analysis might be important in terms of a treatment modality. Why is feedback and knowing why might that work for an individual? And you know, this is tied up around pain mechanisms and around behavior change theory, and so it's about linking those together and understanding those things. Okay, can we move on to the next slide now? Okay, so my research, Mohammed's research recently, what we've been doing a lot of is working around development of sensor-based intervention. And this has been a sensor-based intervention which we are using within the physiotherapy department in terms of helping people move. So as anybody will know that works in intervention development, it's not just of maybe coming up with the idea and running with it. And I think especially with movement analysis, in terms of being happy that we are measuring what we expect to be measuring and we know that our data is trustworthy, there's a lot of steps to that. And we've been working for a number of years now on those different steps. And so some of the things we've been doing is we've been, first of all, been looking at the reliability and validity of the sensor set we've been using. And that's been very much lab-based work with individuals in a movement analysis laboratory, looking at how does the sensor set compare to the gold standard movement analysis, which we know they know we operate in different ways. And so, but just looking at that, and also looking at the reliability between maybe somebody who does a lot of movement analysis in terms of lab-based work versus somebody who works in a clinician. And although they do a lot of observational analysis, don't often do the placing of the sensors. And so looking at the reliability of the two different individuals or groups of people doing sensor-based movement analysis. So we've got a paper on that. I've got a reference further in my presentation so you can have a look at that work. What we also did is come up with, based on the number of years of work we've done in movement analysis, came up with a movement analysis report that we thought would be suitable for a clinical setting, both for the patients to look at and the physiotherapists to use with the patients in terms of a summary of how people are moving. And we've piloted that report. And we've got some data from that. We've also done physiotherapist training, because although physiotherapists do a lot of observational analysis, we probably talk a different language to movement scientists. And we often aren't used to looking at that data, that objective data. And so what we did do is do some work around giving people training in the areas that they felt they needed training around that. We've also done the data collection in clinics. So we've done this in orthopedic clinics, and we've done this within the physiotherapy department in terms of collecting the sensor-based data, in terms of just doing that to collect the data. And then we've been doing that in terms of the physiotherapist then having the report and their interpretation of the report. So one of the things that we've really stayed away from is giving recommendations based on our movement analysis. As a physiotherapist, I feel quite strongly that it should be the physiotherapist that interprets that data and has the skills and the skill set. That's, you know, it's core to what we do as a physiotherapist to be able to make the decisions based on based on the movement analysis, because they are integrating it, like I've already shown you on previous slides. They're integrating that information with the movement analysis data with lots of other information. And so we do not make any recommendations. We display on what our research has been around in our reports, and how we do biomechanics feedback has been around the visual display of the information. And then we've done some case studies with patients and physiotherapists around the acceptability of doing movement analysis. And then there's a little box there at the bottom, which is about machine learning and reducing sensor sets. And this is, again, the newer work. It's about, you know, what we've been doing and working with EWWD about now moving this beyond the clinic, and even for the clinic, making a reduced sensor set that is much more practical to be used in terms of collecting this information. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we've been using this, you know, not just within the clinic, but outside the clinic. You can use this outside, and this slide's to illustrate that. There's a picture there of the sensor set we're using, which is the XSense data set. We've also, in addition to the information from the sensor, so obviously I'm saying that we come up with a report, but it also comes up with a movement avatar that clinicians can use with patients in terms of showing people how they move. And the avatars have formed an important part of our report that we've created, because actually they're quite an anonymized video of somebody, so you wouldn't know who that person is from that avatar. So they've been quite popular in the clinical setting in terms of being able to look at and show people how they're moving, having this sort of very pictorial format, but also being able to have the objective data alongside that. So could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so this is just a snippet from our report. Here you can see that we produce graphs. We have some annotations around them in terms of some icons around what the joint's doing. We label planes, sides of movements, and we plot injured, non-injured, operated, and non-operated over average cycles of movement. We also give them time, distance, type of data as well, which is on the report. And like I said, we've done a lot of work in terms of looking at validity and reliability, and also looking at this standardized report, because actually then you've got the issue of, are the sensors reliable, accurate? But actually, in terms of how physiotherapists look at the movement and interpretation of the report, is there a consistency to that? And then is there a consistency to how they document that? And so we've been looking at that as well in our work. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just a summary of some of the data, some of the studies we've been doing. So the validity and the reliability, looking at the consistency of therapists in using the movement analysis report, looking at movement compensations, movement adaptations that people might use and that you identify in the clinical setting using this sensor set from observational perspectives, but also from a statistical perspective as well. And also doing lots of interviews around the acceptability of this to clinicians and also to patients, and that's currently part of a number of PhD studies that we have running, and also some other funded studies. Okay, so the next slide, Mohammad. Okay, so I think this is the video.
Yes.
I'm not sure, are we going to be able to play the video?
Okay.
Okay.
Are you able to run it?
So this is a video that's of our work and just some feedback from patients about it. And that's why I wanted to show you this. So it's some of what patients have had to say about using wearable technology. Is there sound? Is it possible to have sound?
Sure.
And if you press play again. If it's not possible, then that's fine. I will, Mohammad could paste the link to where this is on YouTube, the video, if people would like to watch it beyond this presentation.
Is it better now? No.
No, so don't worry, that's fine. Mohammad will, you know, it is really challenging, these things. So what we'll do is Mohammad will paste the link to this video that we've got, and so that anybody can have a look at the video in terms of what the patients have had to say around the clinic-based movement analysis. So that's fine. So if we stop that now. And this was an engagement project funded by the I can put the link up of who this is funded by in a minute. Wellcome Trust. Okay, so if you go back to the presentation, I don't have too many small slides left now. Okay, so this is just to give you a bit of a sense of what maybe patients and clinicians are saying. This is taking from some of the PhD work that's been doing. So, I mean, one of the great things, clinicians, you know, find it really acceptable and got really quite excited about the visual representation of how people move. So people want to still be able to see, you know, don't want to get rid of that in terms of observing, but actually seeing some graphs around the movement. People have been really, really positive around and come up with ideas of how that would change how they actually treat the patient. Oh, so they're moving like that. So maybe what I'd want to focus a bit more on is getting them to do these sort of specific control exercises around bending their knees during that functional task. So that kind of thing could come up with some really good ideas, but they want the graphs annotated and as visual as possible with little pointers and helpers around where in movement cycles any adaptations might be happening that they thought were interesting. And actually they were able to, I mean, we'd given people some training around identifying movement compensations, you know, they had that, but they were able to identify some of the movement compensations. But what we did find is lots of variability in terms of terminology being used. So a lot of inconsistency probably for potential in terms of talking across individuals in terms of how they've used the movement analysis and which might then reflect in treatments. And I think one of the things that I haven't put down there is always this concern about time. How am I going to fit this into my consultation? You know, I've already got a lot to do. You know, where does this fit? It's going to take me longer. But I really love it. But it's that thinking through how do we change things then to be able to make it work within a clinical setting. The patients, we've done serial interviews with them before and after they've experienced sort of the wearable technology and looked at the reports. And actually what I was really struck with the individuals we recruited, and it's not that we recruited all of one type of individuals. We had, you know, obviously with qualitative work, it's not generalizable and it's not and we didn't, it can't be extended really, our findings beyond our group, but we did have varieties in terms of backgrounds, age groups, genders, and interest actually in sports. I think that's the important thing. And actually, I was really impressed at how people were really reporting what they liked was the fact that it made them be able to understand their physiotherapist, that they could then see more of what the physiotherapist was talking about, and it gave credibility in terms of what they should be doing in terms of their treatment, and the fact that it was really nice that then they could come back on another treatment and see how things had changed. It also gave them the motivation to do their exercises because of that, and the fact they felt that reported things like, oh, but my physiotherapist would now be able to see if I don't do my exercises. So I think, it's quite interesting what they're having to say. And what they really pointed us out is that they want physiotherapists to use the sensors, the movement analysis, the report with them. It's not something they just want to have done on them and be sent away with or sent. They want it to be integrated within a consultation, which does pose challenges with new technology and looking at current consultations and the setups of how we deliver care into making that a feasible option. And I think another important thing from the patient interviews is looking again at time, that this is not something that needs to be done on every consultation that they have, and it's when is the key points within the care that they receive in terms of doing this. Okay, next slide. Just to move off the movement analysis, but to just re-emphasize the importance of probably integrating other information alongside the movement analysis. I've been involved in a project that was funded by Health and Care Research Wales, the IMP project. You can read, there's a number of publications from it. I've just put the one there, but looking about using routine referral data for patients with hip and knee pain to improve their access. So this was about improving their access to specialist care. It was about referral pathways and who received optimal care. But from that, we could look also at what factors were predicting pain and function at 6 months consultation. And I think some of the really important things that we could pick out, we had 634 individuals which were recruited, and we took all this different data in terms of PROMs, clinical data, referral letters, and did text mining around the referral letters, and had, I think, 26, we reduced it to 26 variables in the end that were included in the sort of regression analysis. And the important predictors, and I guess for me, the minimal thing I would want in anything is age, body mass index. This was absolutely crucially important, the body mass index, smoking, non-smoking, comorbidity index, which is around how many comorbidities they had, a medication history in terms of predicting their pain and function at 6 months post consultation. Okay, next slide. Learning and next steps, right? So one of the things I think in terms of my work I've done around digital technologies, I've done a lot around looking at in terms of websites and integration into clinical practice. What we've learned around the sensors is trustworthiness. That's what you will be asked by clinicians. I think it's really important that we know what we're measuring is what it should be measuring, that we're really happy that we've done all that research in the lab, that we know that our algorithms are trustworthy, they're measuring what they're measuring. And there can be a natural distrust of information, and this is something I've found in my own research in terms of just looking at video. People don't always believe what the video's showing them. So I think it's important that we think about that just because we create these things, it doesn't mean to say they're naturally going to be used in clinical practice. So I think in terms of thinking about integration is important. Next steps, user-friendly sensors, storage of information, and having a patient-friendly interface, clinician-friendly interface, so that we can use this more around the home environments. User-friendly outputs, visual, they've got to be usable by both patients and clinicians. And what's really important is we need something for the home, and it's needed. And I think we need to be for me, it's important in terms of all the research I do about online physiotherapy, supporting self-management. This has a real important part to play in this around exercise prescription, around patient education. I think really important that I'm not too keen. You always hold back about making recommendations to clinicians, but I do think we could start to look around from the information we get from the movement analysis. What exercises do people go on to be prescribed, and so maybe that we could have these progressions that are built in for people. But I very much wouldn't want to see the physiotherapist or the clinician totally removed from the loop. And I think we need to think about integration into practice, how we go about that, I think is important. And also the reach of this, you know, we don't want this, if it's going to be used in healthcare, I wouldn't want to think this is only accessible to certain groups of individuals. So we might need to make something, I guess, that's affordable and reached to make sure that it can be accessed by a large range of individuals that we might encounter within the real life healthcare settings. Okay, that's my presentation over. Obviously, I've got lots of acknowledgements in terms of the PhD students, clinicians, and Mohammad and all the other people who've worked with to do this research and work. So that's my presentation over with. So I think we're going to questions now.
Thank you very much, Kate. So yes, I think we will have, I think, around 20 minutes for questions and discussions. So if anyone really want to just speak and ask questions, just feel free really to do so. But we will back to Lexi question. How are you defining detecting pathology in a user's gait? I will start with this a bit, but we know the pathological gaits usually detected by looking at the lack of the symmetry and the coordination between the movement of the both limbs. But this is usually, I personally found that this is a bit challenging, because once we go outside the laboratory, I think even the movement itself, the gait, it might be changed. And then how we are going to detect this. And I think this is the beauty here, what we are trying really to do now in the EWWD, which is to collect data from people using what we could call the standard technology, but from outside laboratories. And then we need to look at like how people who don't have any known pathological conditions may affect their gait, to look at this, to use it as a normal database, and then to compare this with the data from patients. And then we need to build like a matrix to understand which components or which parameters we need to use to distinguish between pathological gait and non-pathological gait. Now, this is where we are going. The other things we also, at the moment, we're using is usually to detect any gait, pathological gait. We look at the gait events that mark the transition from one gait subphase to another. So then we look at the subphases, because the subphases, from my perspective, it's a bit essential to evaluate the gait abnormalities. And the standard, well, what we call, I think, mathematically standard deviations, but the deviations within the gait and within the subphases, it's really, I think it's important to be used in terms of detecting gait pathology. This is my understanding how we could detect this, but anyone else really happy to jump in and agree or disagree or just add more information, I'm more than welcome, please. Lex, is that the answer to your question, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you've kind of really highlighted the challenge there, which I think is an interesting one. You've got an enormous potential to collect really good, valid measures of gait in the field, but more data isn't always better, I guess. And part of the challenge is knowing kind of which parts of that are useful, which parts to extract, and whether, you know, I guess what your goal is with that. You know, are you trying to identify, you know, a pathological gait in someone, and that is a kind of a red flag to a clinician who can then pick up on it, and it kind of does the clinician's job for them, or is the clinician being asked to interpret a whole mass of data, which might be a challenge in itself. So I guess it's that kind of what's the link between the technology and the clinician, which and what you were trying to achieve from that?
Yeah, I can take that for you, Mohammed. So
Yep.
what we would be looking to do there, Lex, would be to literally allow the machine to learn these pathological gaits for itself. So we fundamentally come down to a classification question. So can the machine classify the gait into particular pathologies? Now, of course, fundamentally at the end of the day, it's only going to give, say, a percentage probability. So it's going to be saying, with say something like a 90% probability, I think it's this sort of gait. However, that's then something that we can absolutely surface to the clinician, and then the clinician can decide how they want to use that information. What we wouldn't do, and this is why the curves I showed you earlier come with a serious health warning. We would never show those curves to a clinician. I don't see a world in which we want to be bombarding clinicians with raw data or even the outputs of models to such an extent that they have to go into that and say, like, at 2 p.m. yesterday, I see that you had a little bit of a wobble in your gait. Rather, what we should do is we should actually be working to make the tools smart. I mean, the way I look at it is quite simply summed up by saying that we're going to apply our augmentative intelligence to the problem. So we are looking to augment the clinician and to give them tools and information that they don't have at the moment, that they would then be able to apply to this to the patient that they have in front of them. And also, as I think Kate touched upon, is actually being able to see what your gait is like outside of the laboratory, outside, in your everyday life. The example we quite like to use within Hex is Aunt Mabel. So your 80-year-old Aunt Mabel, who goes into town on the bus, she has to step on and off the bus, she has to sort of go up and down curbs, etc. All of these sort of factors are not built into a gait laboratory. They're not something that necessarily even come to mind when she's out and about, or when she comes in to see the doctor. But they are information that we could actually add in to say, hey, look, it looks like when sort of Aunt Mabel has to go up and down a step, she's got a problem there. She does it very stiffly.
So I guess that leads on to my other question is this: how do you deploy this? So you talked about having this with Aunt Mabel and what she goes about in daily life, but then how do you overcome having these such variability in what someone is doing in everyday life, and then being able to compare that to what someone's going to be doing in a gait lab, for example? So if you've got someone that's outside and you're collecting data throughout the whole of their day, and they run through a bus, they step up a curb, they walk downhill, they walk uphill, they've got to carry their shopping. All of these things are going to have a massive impact on how someone changes the way they walk, and that might create a clinical red flag. But if they were walking normally in a gait lab, but it's just that they're holding their shopping and there's nothing to worry about, and that would be very difficult to identify that, at 10:32 on Monday morning, don't worry, I was carrying my shopping. It's not that my gait was doing anything strange. So I guess.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt there. I mean, but answering that question, I mean, it's looking for consistent inconsistencies, if you like. It's looking, it's having a system which would never turn around just on the basis of one set of observations and say, okay, it looks like Aunt Mabel's got a problem. In that shopping example, it could be that actually every Monday she goes and she does her shopping. So there's a sort of an obvious pattern there, but it only occurs on a Monday. So maybe the doctor just could then ask her, and she says, "Oh, I do the shopping." Equally though, it's like if for example there is strong evidence of stiffness in one of her joints, then that's something that we would want to highlight. And given that the sort of the referral periods, anything between 2 and 6 weeks, you're looking at Aunt Mabel wearing it for that period of time. So you're actually over that period of time. That's when we're capturing that data. And in the observational trials that we've got planned, we're looking at it over a period of time, capturing the data, not just sort of taking it off of one event. And also that's where the sort of the more intelligence of the platform comes in and trying to sort of detect the activity that Aunt Mabel is performing. Maybe in that case with the shopping, we'd also detect, because if she's carrying shopping, there's probably more force when she's walking along, and therefore the force through the insoles might be a bit more. So it's also a case of sort of breaking the sort of the question down, if you like, so that we can be as intelligent as possible when we're presenting that back to the clinician. I'm not trying to sort of minimize it as a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge, but that's why it's worth doing, I think.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Lex. Any other questions?
Jane had some questions.
Yeah.
She's had to go.
Unfortunately, she's gone. Yeah.
Yes. It's around how, I think it's some of what you've just touched on. How do you decide what can be modified and what's the benefit to a patient? Stuart, that's some of what you've touched upon there, in terms of identifying, what is a problem. As a clinician, and the research I've done today, we've left that up to clinician interpretation. I think the data that you get from the sensors in terms of is not like a movement analysis laboratory in terms of all the variables you get. It has been a bit more manageable up to now. But I think it's everything that Stuart said. I could keep talking about that, but I probably shouldn't. So is there any other questions?
I think Jane also had a couple of questions she left there. So monitoring is, I think it's, yep. So any other questions?
I think we'll reach out to Jane by email after this. But I mean, one comment I would make on Jane's question about if the AI database can be used to predict and thus inform the education prescription. I think absolutely one of the places we should get to as part of involving 2,000 plus patients is to get to that point where we can actually look like, be able to make those sorts of inferences and say, this is a patient where it looks like this sort of physiotherapy might be of benefit. Again, it's only providing the clinician with a recommendation. It's not actually turning around and automatically, for example, putting them on a particular rehabilitation path or anything like that. But it is, sort of saying, hey, it looks like this person might benefit from X. And then the clinician, probably an advanced physiotherapist, could take that and actually look at it in the context of all the other information that's been collected about that patient as well.
Yeah, I think the other things I want to add here, the platforms we are talking about, maybe yes, we are focusing today only on the quality movement model here, which is purely biomechanics model. But this is, I think the AI platform will be like a combination between the biomechanical model and the prompts and other factors, which is it will help to make these predictions about each patient.
Yes, absolutely. So we are looking at the biomechanical models. We're looking at patient-reported outcomes. We are looking at vital signs, and we are also looking at obviously the history that the patient presents with. So, which can be as important as all of those other factors. So the idea is not just to rely upon one single factor. It is to actually intelligently combine those factors together to then come up with the outcome which is going to be best for the patient.
But I think, Stuart, like you said earlier, it's about breaking the project down into different components at different times, isn't it? Yeah. It's not trying to achieve all that in the first go. I mean, it's around getting the high quality data to start with is the key things.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think the pretty things about this project now, I'm not aware of any database, any movement analysis database outside the laboratory. So I think this is one thing we are going to establish now, and to help, it will help us, I think, to design all these platforms, because I think, Alex, your point, it's really important about, I think, this challenge outside the lab and when we need to monitor patients outside. So if we need to compare it directly just to the movement analysis laboratory, I think this is not fair comparison, and it might not lead to something useful for either patients or even the clinicians. So I think this is our first task, which is how we need to create. Well, we are working now on creating this database, and I think the point as well with this workshop, which is to attract and to collaborate with more academics really in establishing this database. And as Jean-Luc said from the beginning, so we need this database to be available for all researchers by the end of the project. So every scientist will get benefit from this database. Are you able to correlate physical activity with disease activity? I will leave Kate to answer these questions because we have done some work, I think, around this. Kate.
Are you able to correlate physical activity with disease activity? So you're, I'm not sure. Can you just could you just explain that a little bit more? Sorry.
Yeah. Hi everyone. What I'm trying to understand is, you're doing a lot of quality of movement analysis.
Yes.
Are you able to, beyond the potential prediction and physio recommendations that you could draw out from that, are you also working on, how you relate that to pain, maybe swelling? If you think of rheumatoid arthritis, for example, is that something that you're also working on? Because that then takes different data points that looks also at the clinical, kind of blood samples, etc. I'm not getting a sense of whether this is something that you're also looking at or not.
Yes, so definitely, it isn't all just about movement analysis in its own right, and it is important to bring in those other factors as well. And so I guess today's about the movement analysis component, but yes, there is work going on about bringing in those other factors as well. And what I should say is, there is some rings, or I say fences around the pathologies that we are looking at, because, and we're very much interested in the MSK pain groups as well. I guess, you've talked around, mentioned rheumatoid arthritis there. Certainly from probably the work we're doing in Cardiff, we wouldn't be extending out into the rheumatoid arthritis group. Great to get there once, but I think we need to have a model that this works for before moving out to too many other pathologies. My visions might not be ambitious enough, so I'll let other people contribute to that answer.
If I may very briefly try and give my tuppence worth. Our view really is relatively straightforward. One of the activities that we are currently have underway is a mapping, for example, of the 16 various clinical pathways for foot and ankle. So to answer your question, Jimmy, if we were to take hallux rigidus, take that disorder, we would want to look at, what the patient presents with, look at statistically the age of the patient, and then be able to make inferences on that 50-something-year-old patient, knowing that 1 in 40 patients over the age of 50 suffer with this disorder. And then we input all the other parameters that clinicians would want to see into the model to be able to say, okay, well, we think it's this, the GP presented and thinks it's this, and then we monitor that patient, not just their quality of movement, but their vital signs, as Stuart has also said, but also, you can start looking at inferences on the insole, for example, the change in the way that the patient walks, from sort of a heel strike through pushing off their weight through the big toe, will fundamentally change under that disorder, and we can start to measure that particular data set as well as other activities that may happen. Now, we know with hallux rigidus, for example, that in many patients, manifestly there is no change. They are in pain, but it won't get much worse with the appropriate care and footwear, etc. But in other patients, it can lead to foot deformity and potential amputation. And in which case, what we want to do in those cases is actually look at, in the same way that we might want to measure Charcot or gout differentials in foot temperatures, looking at the pressure displacement on the insole, and then potentially also, looking at, the whole post-operative, getting the patient back to normality and walking properly. So the answer to your question really is, we are building data sets across it, lower limb MSK, importing that and feeding that into the model. And frankly, the more data we get, as I think everyone is well aware with these models, the better the platform will be in terms of not necessarily diagnosing, but we talk in terms of decision trees, effectively saying, well, taking all these factors into consideration, I'm ruling out these things because, frankly, either the patient hasn't reported those outcomes or our data hasn't, or the sensors haven't picked up those outcomes. We don't believe it's these things, but for the next clinical appointment with the most appropriate clinician, these are the things that they may want to look at based on the data that we present to them on the user interface. So the answer is we are looking at it, and I think Kate was correct in saying it's, whilst this workshop is about quality of movement, there is a huge amount more work going on in the background about pathologies and trying to make sure we map this correctly.
Cool, thanks. So follow-up question based on what you just said. Are you guys looking also at capturing data sets from, platforms like Fitbit and Garmin, Apple Watch, this kind of things as well?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I mean, we had a meeting a few weeks back talking about ambient temperatures and recovery, different patients' recovery in different temperatures, and we thought, wow, that's actually a really great idea, and we need to do that, and we will look at that. I think if you're talking about just the types of data sets that, and I guess let me ask you a question rather than making a statement. Are you talking about the data sets that they have that we could potentially query, or are you actually asking us, are we aiming to capture the similar sorts of data that Garmin and Fitbit provide? Well,
what they provide tends to be fairly generic, but at the same time, that's quite well spread in the population. So that has a lot of validity in terms of that's used by a lot of people, as opposed to getting people into a gait lab and kind of having maybe a session more focused. That gives you more of a continuous monitoring type of picture of, I mean, very quickly of a lot of people is kind of what I'm getting at. So if you, again, I'm kind of trying to get my head around the whole thing, but it sounds like you're aggregating a lot of data. So it does sound like that could be a nice pool to kind of look into, even if it's maybe not as qualitative of what you're doing now. You could have correlations drawn out potentially from those. So I'm just trying to understand if that's an area of focus for you guys or not really.
So thank you for the clarification. The answer is yes. So one of our partners, Dyden, who have built their own AI platform, our vision and our work really for EWWD, and I'm not sure if Hans Peter is actually on the call. If he is, he can talk a lot to this himself. But we are looking to read in external data sources. So whether it's Fitbit, Garmin, Cleveland Clinic, or any other data sources that are available to us, our vision is to read in other data sets to ensure that we are continuously learning, not just from laboratory data or clinical or observational trial data, but from other data sets, external data sets. The question really is validation and not looking at generic data and trying to infer things that probably are not right in that. But yes, is the answer.
Cool, thanks for clarifying.
Okay, thank you very much, Jimmy. So there's a question from Lauren. I think there's a number of questions from Lawrence here. So do you think there is a risk of clinicians using this data to support clinical reasoning for presence of pain in a similar way that poor posture is so often reported to be the causes of the back pain?
So what I think, Lauren, you know, that's an important point you raise, and that's not what we would anticipate here. That we're not saying that just because somebody moves in a certain way that is absolutely the cause of why they've got their problems. But it is one of the pieces of information that that clinicians might use to inform what treatment they might go on to give people. You know, and it is complex. I don't think it's very, the decision making around that is very complex, and people take on multiple bits of information, but there's no getting away from the fact that what we learn about how people move in their home, natural environments, is probably something that we've not had access to before, but is actually going to be very important in terms of it's maybe looking like I'm saying risks of falls, trips. It's about what exercises you could potentially do, because how you move might be an indication of weakness, restricted range of motions. So I think that, and you've got to couple that with all the other information. So no, I don't think it's going to be used it's not to be used in the same way that we've just said, oh, you're sitting like that, so that's the cause of your back pain.
Okay.
And I think, do you want me to add? So the next part is, we know that posture is varied among individuals. Yep. You know, yes, we agree with that. And we're definitely not saying there's a standardized way of moving. We know that, and there's lots of variations on that. And I think Stuart's already dealt with some of that in the responses that he's given to the questions. Do you think there's a difference between the normative data and pathological data for quality of movement? Yes, we are finding, you know, this is interesting. When you look at normal data and pathological data, you've got to be very careful how you use normative data, because maybe how a 20-year-old is not going to be the same as, you know, you've got to be, as an older person, there's lots and lots of factors there. So I think, you know, it's not just as simple as comparing to a normative database at sort of discrete time points. But I think that's where Stuart and his team will be bringing in their knowledge in order to make sure that this is done robustly.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate.
There's a question for you, I think, Stuart.
I think so. Okay, so Thomas has asked if artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning seem to be used interchangeably here and throughout literature. So do these refer to more or less the same thing, or are these different concepts? Generally, when you see them in literature, they are sort of being used interchangeably, and there is a famous quote out there, which is, if it's written in Python, it's machine learning. If it's written in PowerPoint, it's artificial intelligence. But that's sort of just you know, one of those standard ones you come across normally on LinkedIn. The way I look at it is quite simple, and this is just my personal definition. Machine learning and deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. Machine learning is basically teaching the machine patterns. So it's a machine looking for patterns in the data. There are many different ways of doing that. There's supervised machine learning, there's unsupervised machine learning, there's reinforcement learning, and there are many different sort of techniques that you can use. And deep learning is one of the many techniques that you can use when it comes to machine learning. Artificial intelligence, the way I look at artificial intelligence is actually trying to, it's an ecosystem of things. It's bringing together data and algorithms in a sort of a way which can support like, you know, the outcomes that you're looking for. You know, Alexa is artificially intelligent within a narrow band. That's also why I prefer also to use the term augmented intelligence. What we're looking to do is we're looking to sort of add something to what the clinician is having and the experience of the patient through the intelligence that we can apply and through the algorithms that we come up with and the models that we come out with. So moving then on to the next question, what are the main challenges in applying these data science approaches to studying human data movement in real life derived from wearables? Well, partly it's the fact that actually out there, as we've alluded to, and as sort of we found, there aren't data sets. There are not readily accessible data sets where, you know, there are thousands of patients walking for sort of good periods of time. The data sets which do exist out there, and you know, we've been very sort of lucky in working with Mohammad and Kate to get hold of data sets. So far, those data sets are obviously developed in the laboratory, you know, the Gate lab. They therefore are by necessity, in data science terms, relatively small and relatively short, and they don't actually cover necessarily large volumes of individuals. When we come to then applying that in the real world, what we find is that, you know, for example, the commercial off-the-shelf sensors can suffer from things like data drop. You can have data loss. You can have sensors going in and out of the sort of the matrix. So you have to deal with all of that, and also it's the fact that, you know, if I'm just sitting around doing nothing and we're capturing all of that data, and then I get up and I take a few steps and I wander around, that is very messy data when compared to getting somebody just to walk backwards and forwards in a Gate laboratory, or even worse, when you look at some of the papers that certainly I know that Mohammad will probably chuckle at this, but we have found a number of papers in doing our work where they have very selectively chosen the most perfect sort of, you know, gait, you know, the range of movement and the gait cycles to demonstrate and to prove the model. So, you know, you're always going to get a brilliant outcome if you can select the data. We don't have that luxury when you're dealing with real world data. So actually what we have to do is we have to get the artificial intelligence system to select the data that it needs itself. And that's one of the challenges. So yes, there's a lot of challenges to overcome, but that's actually why it's, you know, again, that's why, as I say, that's why it's worth doing, because if it was easy, somebody else would have done it years ago.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. So I think we reached to the point where maybe we need tea break for 10 minutes. And so after the tea break, so we will be, I'm not sure if we need to divide ourselves into two groups. And I think the idea of the next session is really to work together in developing potentially new research areas for collaborative research with EWWD. So what that means within each group, the group needs to discuss the shared research interest for potentially new collaborative research projects. And after that, we will come back into one room where each group will present their research plan, and we will consider this research plan within EWWD to seek, I think, to work together on this collaboration, if that's possible. So if we back at around 12:05, that would be great. Okay, thank you everyone.
Cool.
Any more questions? Any comments? Any feedback about the workshop itself? You are more than welcome. So this is our first workshop. So we'd love really to hear any feedback. So, and even you could send us your feedback, I think, by email if you would like as well.
I thought it was really interesting. Really nice mix between industry, academia, and practice. I think the work you're doing has you know, kind of resonance across society and fits in well with a lot of the kind of industrial and strategic research objectives of the UK. And yeah, I think it was just great to be able to kind of disseminate that and spread that so widely. It was a bit, you know, I was expecting there to be lots more people because I think it was a really interesting kind of open seminar, and I'm surprised that there wasn't more people involved. I don't know why that would have been the case, because
I think it was a bit, I can't comment on that because I think it was not 100% open. I think I should really thank Leva and Flora, first of all, for all the work in the background behind this workshop, because they put a lot of efforts really to make this happen. So thank you very much, both of you. And it's also, they just being introduced to the Zoom as well. So this is another challenge. So it's including myself as well. So it's a new things to the Zoom things to run all these workshops, which is we used to run them in different way in real life. But it's again, another learning, something to learn. So if there's no more questions. So I would like really to thank you all for staying till the end. And we will be definitely in touch with you quite soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.